In 1973, these American climbers traveled to Argentina hoping to summit the highest mountain in all of the Americas. But after interviewing them at their hotel, a reporter whispered a very disturbing prediction about them to his photographer. He said, quote, "Take each of their photos today because I don't think they're all coming back." This prediction would turn out to be dead on. No pun intended. Folks, this is not just another story about a climb gone wrong. It's actually the story about the final smiling photos of people who had no idea that they were about to die. It's the story of how egos and broken trust turned a mountain into a straight up battlefield. And some people say it's the story of cold-blooded murder. But we'll get there. And as if that wasn't all traumatic enough, literally decades after this story had been completely forgotten by everybody, a bombshell discovery was made, and well, it might just change everything. But before we take our virtual flight together to Argentina, be sure to buckle up and be sure to hit the subscribe button, especially if you're a regular viewer of the channel. We're trying to reach our goal of 1 million subscribers in 2025, and every single new subscriber gets us just a little bit closer, so I would really appreciate it. Okay, in 1972, Portland lawyer Carmi Duffo convinced his local climbing club to take on the, quote, moderately difficult climb of Aconcagua, which stands at 22,838 feet, which is about 6,961 meters. Carmi would recruit 6 men to go with him, and some of them he had climbed with before, but others were just complete strangers who had been recommended by some of his friends. However, this group would not end up just being full of men, because there was one more person who would end up joining, and she was a woman named Janet Mae Johnson. Janet, who was an elementary school teacher, she didn't appear at first glance to be a formidable climber, we'll say. But with that said, Janet was no slouch. She routinely climbed in the Rockies in Colorado, and she had even summited Kilimanjaro over in Africa. And so with hopeful eyes on Aconcagua, Janet packed her gear, which included her trusty Nicomat film camera, and she flew down to Argentina to meet her fellow climbers. Folks, this did not go well. During their very first night together in Argentina, the Americans just didn't really mesh with each other. Something just fell off. And this was despite the fact that they were still in the comfort of a hotel at this point. They weren't even on the mountain yet, being subjected to Mother Nature's whim. The group was even interviewed by local news about their upcoming expedition, but they just seemed disconnected. I don't really know how else to say it. But at least they weren't climbing alone. They actually had an experienced mountain guide named Miguel Alfonso to lead their way. So the next morning, they left the hotel and they started the journey up to base camp. And the thing you have to know about Aconcagua is that base camp is at 14,000 feet above sea level, which is about 4,300 meters. And from base camp, it's another 8,000 feet or 2,400 meters to the actual peak, right? And so when they arrived at base camp after 2 days of climbing just to get there, they were already feeling the effects of altitude. This was their plan. Carmi Defoe would lead with Miguel as his guide. A man named Jim Petrosky, who was one of Carmi's friends, he would be the deputy leader for the group. Now, one of the climbers was actually bilingual, and so he would translate between Carmi and Miguel, who only spoke Spanish, as well as another doctor. The 4 other climbers in the group were Bill Zeller, who was an American police officer, Arnold McMillan, who was a dairy farmer, and then there was John Cooper, who was a NASA engineer. Like, you heard that right. And of course, there was Janet, once again, who was the teacher. So they had their plan, but even with it, I don't know, something just still wasn't right about this group. And so when they arrived at base camp, the camp manager actually got the same feeling that the reporter had back at the hotel, what I told you about right at the beginning of the video. It was this dark feeling. There was no group attitude here. There was no camaraderie. It kind of just felt like everyone was on their own, every man for himself, right? And perhaps most importantly, even though everyone had fancy professional gear, and so they were prepared in that aspect, it just seemed like they weren't really taking this dangerous expedition as seriously as they probably should have. The climb up Aconcagua takes about a week, all the way up to 2 weeks potentially. And it takes so long because there are 3 camps that you have to kind of progress to on your way up to the peak. And so during the day, you have to be kind of shuttling your gear up the mountain to these various camps. And then at the end of the day, you have to come back down to the base camp to rest. And so you add in the altitude and also the fields of these tall, icy pillars, and you have to navigate through these. You add all that stuff up, and this is obviously a very, very exhausting journey. And this became apparent very quickly because the first few days and nights of the expedition took a major toll on the Americans. And from reports of what the group dynamic was like, once again, the climbers weren't really keeping each other in great company, you could say. The vibes were just very off, as the kids would say these days. And so, yeah, I mean, it was a lot of quiet hiking. As the air got thinner and thinner, the further and further they climbed. They reached Camp 1, but of course they were completely gassed and their spirits were very low. John Cooper, once again, this NASA engineer, he even wrote in his diary that Bill Zeller, the police officer, had been doing most of the gear shuttling. I mean, literally carrying the load, because everyone else was just so sick, tired, and exhausted. And while he did praise Bill in his writing, let's just say that John gave Janet a much less glowing review. So according to John, Janet was pretty much useless. She was mostly just kind of snapping pictures of her fellow climbers as they struggled up the mountain. You could kind of see how that's a bit annoying, right? After a night in Camp 1, they all started to climb together up to Camp 2, but it wasn't long until 3 of the Americans basically just gave in to the exhaustion. They quit. And this actually included the group's leader, Carmi Defoe, as well as their translator and the doctor in the group. All these people turned back. And that left Jim Petrosky to now be the de facto leader for the climbers. And yet, despite these setbacks, the smaller group actually fared a little bit better than when everyone was still involved. They ended up making it to Camp 3 in just a few days, and they were even able to relax for an entire day and kind of wait out a snowstorm. The very next morning, the climbers emerged from their tents, well rested, and they saw something very, very surprising. That was the summit of the mountain. The weather had done a complete 180. It was now completely clear. The sky was beautiful. The snow was even powdery, not icy, which would make it easier to climb. And so this was very, very exciting for the group. They made a big breakfast. They kind of started to get ready. And for the first time, since they had arrived in Argentina, it felt like they were actually a team, a team with this common goal. And they decided that today was the day to make the final push up the Polish glacier and reach Aconcagua's peak. Like, they'd come all this way and it was finally time to do this. Folks, this is pretty much the high point of this story, and they're not even at the peak yet. Everything was about to fall apart in pretty much the worst way you can possibly imagine, and obviously that means things are about to get pretty dark. And so before we get there, I just want to lighten up the mood a little bit, take a chill pill, and I want to tell you about Drink Element. Summer is just around the corner. You might have noticed it's getting pretty nice out there. It's getting sunny, it's getting hot, and that means that I'm getting sweaty, which is a weird thing to say in front of thousands of people. But here's the thing. When you sweat, you need to replace your electrolytes. If you don't, you're gonna get muscle cramps, you're gonna get fatigued. I've experienced this on so many hikes in the past, and thankfully now I have Drink Element to prevent all of that stuff. Element has all the electrolytes that you need to stay hydrated and healthy whenever you're doing any sort of activity that makes you sweat. And Element does not have a bunch of sugar and a bunch of crap like you're gonna find in all of the other electrolyte drink mixes. Citrus salt is probably my favorite Element flavor, although grapefruit salt, I always go back and forth between those. Even orange salt is so good. They have so many amazing flavors is what I'm getting at, and you really want to try them all. Click the link at the top of the description or go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. And when you do that and you make a purchase through my link, you are going to get a sample pack of 8 additional Element flavors thrown in with your order for no extra cost. One more time, drink link, lmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, or click the link. Do it right now. Okay, back to the story. So the climbers woke up and everyone's kind of getting ready to make that final summit push. But as they were doing this, Jim, who was now the group's new leader, well, he was kind of lagging behind. He was struggling with things as simple as just putting on his crampons, which is like an essential thing if you're going to be climbing a big mountain like this. He tried to stand up, but he could barely even do that without basically falling over. And so this was obviously very worrisome for the group. Jim was experiencing symptoms not just of altitude sickness, but of severe, potentially fatal brain swelling. And so basically, Jim needed to get to a lower elevation as soon as possible or he was gonna die. But the other 4 Americans, well, they all felt great. They weren't about to give up. I mean, they'd come all this way, and so they're not gonna turn back now. And so Miguel, the local guide there, the only one who actually knew the route by heart, and also the only one who didn't need the ego boost of summiting the mountain, because he'd done it before, well, he decided to take Jim back down to base camp. And this selfless act probably saved Jim's life, by the way. And so now, the only 4 climbers left were Bill, the police officer, Arnold, the farmer, John, the NASA engineer, and Janet, the teacher. Both of their previous leaders had now turned around. They now had nobody in charge, really. They had no clear roles, and frankly, they had no chance in hell. Let me just say that the next series of events are a version of kind of what's been cobbled together from those who didn't die. And the stories of the survivors don't completely align with the evidence. And at some points, frankly, they don't even align with each other's stories. And so after I tell you what the survivors say happened, be sure to keep watching until the end of the video, because literally years after all of this took place, there was that insane discovery I alluded to earlier that has given us a much better sense of what actually happened on the mountain that day. But we'll get there. So Bill, Arnold, John, and Janet made a plan. They were going to climb the Polish glacier, summit Aconcagua, and then return to camp all before the sun went down, right? This meant about 2,000 feet or just over 600 meters of climbing. And it was only about a half a mile, by the way, a very short distance. And so they grabbed their ice axes and they lightened their packs, leaving some of their heavier gear behind, and they began climbing, right? And once again, they were trying to do all this before the sunset, and so they had to move. And I don't know if the conditions changed or if they just misjudged their energy levels, but the dark truth is that they did not move fast enough. And speaking of darkness, well, eventually it would set in. They didn't make it in time. And by the time this happened, they were still 1,000 feet or just over 300 meters away from the summit. I mean, folks, they were officially in the danger zone at this point, we'll say. Their flashlights were pretty useless against the blackness that was all around them. And once again, they packed so lightly for this final push. They didn't have any tents or sleeping bags, and they barely even had any food. And of course, this is a massive deal because obviously the climbers realized they weren't going to make it to the summit and they weren't going to be able to make it back down to their camp. And so they had no choice but to just spend the night there, completely unsheltered, right there on the glacier. This is a climber's worst nightmare. Using their ice axes, the 4 climbers quickly dug this snow cave on the side of the glacier. And then once inside, they tried their best to sleep on top of these reflective space blankets, which separated their shivering bodies from the ice beneath them a little bit, but it's still not very ideal. And it turns out that Janet and Bill just simply couldn't handle being packed in so tightly. And so they would actually end up moving outside the cave, and they literally just sat there in the bone-chilling wind all night. And yet, despite how awful this situation was, thankfully, everyone survived. Well, at least for now, I'll say. And by the morning, this is also just insane, most of them decided that they were still going to try to go reach the summit. However, John, well, he came to the opposite conclusion. He told them that he was completely done. He had been miserable since Camp 1, and now at 21,000 feet, or about, 6,400 meters, with the summit right there, mind you, in sight. Well, now he was gonna quit. He was gonna climb about 2 hours back down the glacier, all the way back down to Camp 3. And with this, it seems that the fleeting camaraderie that the group had experienced the day before, well, it seems like it was rapidly depleting, we'll say. And a perfect example of this is that when John decided to turn around, nobody in the group accompanied him. No one else went with him. They left him essentially to descend all on his own. So now there's only 3 of them left, and they moved slowly but consistently up the Polish glacier. Janet continued to snap more pictures with her Nicomat film camera as they climbed further and further up. Through her camera lens, Janet saw what looked like the peak of Aconcagua, and they pushed further ahead towards it. However, this view through the lens was actually false hope, as another snowy ridge stood between them and the summit. It's always a little further than it seems. And folks, on this second day of pushing, they once again didn't make it. Darkness set in for the second night in a row, but this time the trio didn't just stop and camp. They decided to just keep going, right? And so the snow was about waist deep at this point, and Bill and Arnold were taking turns kind of breaking the trail ahead of them. And after doing this for some time, the men kind of turned around to go check on Janet, and they were horrified to discover that she was gone. Janet had basically vanished into the pitch black night. And so they frantically began searching. They called out her name over and over and over until finally they heard a whimpering voice off in the distance. It's at this point that they found Janet laying in the snow, way off of the route they had been following, by the way. And she was alive, but she was not doing well at all. Janet was in such bad condition that she literally asked the men to let her, quote, lay here and die. Like, let that sink in. You're gonna hear that quote again in a few minutes here. But of course, Bill didn't let her do this. He picked her up and he tied her to himself. And this is the first kind of moments, we'll say, of where versions of the story kind of start differing. One version says that the 3 of them camped together and did end up braving another freezing night. But then another version says that Arnold went further up ahead of Bill and Janet and then spent the night by himself. Regardless of which one of those versions is true, it was still another freezing night on the glacier. Once again, no tent, at this point, no food, no sleeping bags, and somehow, miraculously, all 3 of them survived the night again. But at this point, Janet was in even worse shape now. I mean, her hands were swollen and black, frostbitten, and frankly, Bill wasn't looking so great either. His face was literally getting blackened from sun exposure at this point. And so with Janet barely hanging on, Bill and Arnold finally made the decision to turn back. And folks, it's worth mentioning that at this point, they were only about 200 feet or about 61 meters from the summit. They were right there. They were so close. But they had no choice. They had to turn around. And so Janet, who was still tied to Bill, was really struggling on the way down. They managed to get past that snow cave they had dug a few nights previously. Arnold even fired off a flare gun that had been left behind in a last-ditch effort to try to get rescued. But of course, no one saw it. No one came to help them. And so Bill was basically carrying Janet down the mountain, and Arnold would end up going ahead of the group because he was moving faster and he hoped that he could get to help more quickly. And so he was kind of booking it down the mountain, right? As fast as he could anyways. And at one point, he says that he fell down a very steep section of the glacier, claiming that he slid headfirst for 1,000 feet or just over 300 meters. And this fall caused him to lose his ice axe and gave him a black eye. He then limped the rest of the way down the mountain as Camp 3 finally came into his vision. But as he was making this final short leg of the trek, he started to hear things. He started to hear voices and see members of the Argentine army passing him to go and rescue Janet and Bill. He started to see lots of things, things like dead mules scattered all around him. And perhaps most strikingly, he saw a soldier sitting there with his his head in his hands just off of the trail. Now, as you probably guessed, most of these sounds and sights did not actually happen. He was hallucinating. But one of the things he saw was actually partially based in reality. Later that night, as Arnold was laying comfortably in his sleeping bag and his tent for the first time in a while, all of a sudden he just woke up with a jolt, and the truth kind of just hit him. That dead soldier that he thought he had seen, well, it wasn't actually a soldier. It was John Cooper. Remember, John had left the group sometime earlier and he hadn't been seen or heard from since. In the meantime, Bill and Janet were taking their time as they went down. And at one point, Bill started to actually hallucinate as well. He was hearing voices of phantoms who promised to rescue them. He was seeing construction trucks parked on the mountain. And all of a sudden, Bill kind of snapped out of it. But that's when he says that he and Janet also took a fall. And folks, this one was much, much worse. Remember, the two of them are tied together, but when they fell, of course, this rope came undone. And so they go tumbling, and after Bill eventually stopped and kind of took a second to take stock and kind of see how far he had fallen, he looked down in front of him and was actually stunned to see that Camp 3 was right there. He was that close to safety. But since he had fallen further down than Janet did, he actually turned around and went back up to try and go check on her. But before he could even reach her, Bill reached someone else, and this, of course, was John Cooper. According to Bill, John didn't have any cuts on his skin, he didn't have any tears in his clothing, and he sat kind of facing the direction of the tents down in Camp 3. And it was unclear what had happened, but one thing was clear as day, and that was that John Cooper was dead. And so Bill makes this determination, and then he keeps going up to try to find Janet. And fortunately, he did find her alive, shaken up certainly, but she was okay. She had the wind knocked out of her from falling and her glasses were broken. But overall, she was fine, right? And so she was sitting there taking a moment to recover. And this is where one of the more questionable decisions was made, right? And so Bill, who had been carrying everyone pretty much from the get-go, who pretty much saved Janet's life earlier, well, Bill decided to leave Janet there so that he could go down and set up a tent for them at Camp 3. He assumed that she would just take a moment to get her stuff together and then she would follow him when she was ready. And it's easy to criticize in hindsight, obviously, but I don't know. You can understand why this was at least a little bit of a questionable decision, right? And it doesn't really stop there either, because the next questionable decision was that, according to the survivors, when Bill arrived at Camp 3 and met Arnold there, they crawled into their tents and then they just kind of slept through the night. Whether it was due to exhaustion or delusion from the altitude, for whatever reason, they didn't wait up for Janet. And it wasn't until the very next morning, when they woke up, that they finally realized that she hadn't made it, and they started searching for her, but they didn't see anything. They searched for a little while, and then finally they decided to go further down the mountain. And again, it's easy to criticize this stuff when you weren't there and you're not suffering, from altitude sickness and all this stuff, but I don't know. According to Arnold, Bill was so confused that he literally had no idea what direction to even travel. So you can kind of understand the state that they're in, but still, they did kind of leave her there. Janet never made it back down to base camp. 8 climbers in this group went up the mountain, but only 6 of them came back down. John Cooper was dead, and Janet, of course, was assumed dead as well because she had completely vanished after Bill last saw her. John and Janet's bodies remained on the mountain, and as the tragic news began to spread, a media firestorm would be ignited. Questions about this failed expedition followed the survivors everywhere they went, frankly, and they tripped up anyone who tried to get some straight answers, which included the US and the Argentine government, as well as, of course, the families of the dead. I mean, John Cooper was a son, a father and husband, and at NASA, he was active through the entire Apollo program. Janet Johnson was a beloved daughter. Her mother would collect newspaper clippings about this whole story, and if there was ever any misspelling of Janet's name, her mother would literally like cross them out and correct them. And actually, speaking of crossing things out, she was so sickened by her daughter's mysterious death that whenever she saw Janet's quote, where she asked to, quote, be left to die on the mountain, I told you about earlier. Well, whenever her mother saw this in the newspaper, she would immediately cross it out. She couldn't even stand to look at it, right? Both of these families wanted answers about how their loved ones died. Things just didn't really seem to add up. And also, both families wanted their bodies retrieved. Unfortunately, these two things were gonna have to wait because the climbing season was coming to an end. Any attempt to recover the bodies was gonna have to, take place next year. It was too late now. And so the first people under the gun for answers about what happened were the survivors. When Jim Petrosky and Miguel Alfonso turned back down the mountain, John and Janet were still alive. And so the only real potential witnesses to their deaths would have been Bill Zeller and Arnold McMillan. And, based on the story I just told you, they weren't exactly the most reliable narrators, and they didn't really give a ton of clarity to the US or the Argentine government. Once everyone got back to Portland, Oregon, Carmi Defoe's climbing club, the ones that kind of organized this entire disaster expedition in the first place, well, they held this secret meeting to kind of like get ahead of the press and kind of get everyone's story straight, right? And after that meeting, the story that each of the surviving climbers would tell the media and their hometown newspapers was that Janet and John were desperate to reach the summit and that they, quote, probably died of pulmonary edema, which is basically when your lungs fill up with fluid. It's a story that, in theory, does kind of make some sense, and it did answer a number of questions, we'll say, at the time. However, that didn't last very long, because in late 1973, Miguel Alfonso and a crew of other Argentine climbers decided to go back up the mountain to try to find the bodies. And though this wasn't an easy task, they were successful. They came upon what was left of Camp 3 at the time, and it was just kind of windswept, just kind of gear strewn everywhere. And only about 150 yards further uphill from the camp, they found what they came for. They found the frozen body of John Cooper. And they also found his diary. However, what they didn't find was Janet. There was no sign of her anywhere. And here's where things really start to get shaken up, folks. When they found John's body, he was not positioned how Bill and Arnold had said he was earlier. He wasn't sitting like they said. His legs were actually fully extended. And his hands were kind of laying across his midsection, not up kind of towards his face like they had said earlier. And upon a closer look, new details emerged, ones that showed that John didn't die of pulmonary edema like Carmi Defoe had claimed. John's face was battered, and he had this like horrified look on his face. He looked terrified, and just most disturbingly, his hands covered a circular hole in his abdomen, which was bloody and very, very deep. The initial theory about this hole was that John had must have fallen very hard on his ice axe, and as he attempted to examine this painful wound, he basically just went unconscious and died. But another theory quickly emerged. A theory from the very person who actually performed John's autopsy. The coroner said that the wound could not have come from an ice axe handle, which is a rectangular shape. The only object that could have made a circular wound like this was an ice screw. An ice screw driven deeply into his body by someone else. But the autopsy report was even more shocking than that. Ultimately, John's cause of death was not even that wound in his abdomen. Of course, it wasn't the fluid in his lungs like they claimed earlier. It wasn't even hypothermia. The cause of his death was, get this, cranial contusions, injuries to his brain and his skull. This, coupled with that wound, opened up a brand new, unbelievable idea. What if the mountain didn't actually kill John? What if it wasn't an accident? What if somebody else had killed him. We're talking about murder here, folks. And now the pressure was on to find Janet's body, which was basically the next piece of the puzzle for this climbing disaster, now turned possible murder mystery. 2 full climbing seasons went by. Dozens of people climbed Aconcagua, but nobody ever found Janet. That is, until February of 1975, when a 17-year-old was descending from the mountain with his father and a family friend, and he saw something red kind of stuck in one of those fields of ice pillars. Upon inspection, it would turn out that the red was Janet's jacket. And of course, goes without saying, but inside of her jacket was her body. She was laying face up, tangled in rope, missing a crampon, and her ice axe was nowhere to be found. Her boot was slashed in several places as well, which is strange. And she was found within about 100 feet, or say 30 meters, of where John was found. Bit of a warning for you here. Janet was in worse condition, we'll say, than John was. And so if you don't want to hear a description of her, then you can skip ahead about 15 seconds and miss that. But anyways, you good? Okay. So Janet's body was kind of stuck to the ice beneath her, right? And her face was blackened from all the sun exposure over the years. The skin was even lifted off her nose and her forehead, her chin. Her nose was even broken. And lying on top of her body was this singular fist-sized rock. This was a very, very strange find, and it brings up a lot of questions. And so Bill had said that he and Janet had this like long fall down the mountain, right? But the area that her body was found in was actually quite shallow. And the slashes on Janet's boot didn't really look like they were naturally caused. You know, they almost looked intentional, right? And her only wounds were to her face, which is strange because she allegedly took several falls. I mean, wouldn't she have more than just 3 wounds on her face if that was the case? But maybe the weirdest finding of all was that rock I just told you about. There were no other rocks around in this giant ice field. So how did a fist-sized rock end up on top of Janet's body? What is that? Is this a coincidence? Is it a tribute? Was it a weapon? I mean, who knows? And then, folks, the autopsy report came in, which stated that Janet, too, had died of cranial injuries. The same thing as John. Like, something just didn't add up here. And at the time, the media had basically accepted the deaths of John and Janet as climbing accidents. I mean, these things do happen. You know, maybe it was easier that way instead of wondering if something uglier had occurred. But despite this narrative, there were some people that were unconvinced. Both Bill and Arnold, once again, admitted to experiencing hallucinations, you know, voices and visions, things like that. And we know that psychosis at that altitude can lead to illogical actions. Maybe even, and this is a big maybe, but maybe even violent impulses. I mean, I don't know. This obviously needed to be investigated a lot further, but before these possible murders could even be investigated, the world shifted. Argentina's government was overrun by a military coup, and just a year after Janet's body was found, well, the case was essentially buried. The dead were put to rest, John back home in Kansas, and Janet by the trailheads of Aconcagua. Over the years, people would talk every now and again and make up stories about what might have happened. You know, maybe it was this love triangle between John, Janet, and Bill and Arnold that went wrong. But of course, that theory doesn't really make sense because, first of all, Janet was a lesbian. She wasn't attracted to men. And also, as was written in his diary, John didn't really care for Janet very much. And so that didn't really make sense. You know, maybe there was like a serial killer on the mountain that was trying to like secretly rob climbers and steal money. But of course, that's ridiculous too. I mean, climbing Aconcagua is hard enough, but sneaking up and down the mountain, stealing stuff, like that's ridiculous. If I had made this video a few years ago, this would have been the end of the story. But it's not, because as fate would have it, almost 50 years after the mysterious deaths of John and Janet, a bombshell discovery was made, and it held the power to completely rewrite everything that I've told you thus far. In February of 2020, a young porter found an item sitting on top of an ice pillar, and he was kind of unsure what it was, and so he brought it back to a more experienced guide down in their campsite. And when this guide saw it, he was completely shocked, and he also knew exactly what it was immediately. He held in his hands right there a Nicomat camera, and the name Janet Mae Johnson was written across it. Oh, and guess what? There was film inside of it. Now, this camera wasn't the only thing that was found that day. This is a little gruesome, but when those amateur climbers back in 1975 found Janet and tried to, take her body off the mountain, they accidentally left her arm behind. Kind of gross, I know, but 44 years later, these guys that found the camera also found this detached arm, which was still stuck inside the jacket. And in the jacket's pocket, they found 2 more canisters of film. And folks, this film was obviously a massive deal because the photos, if they could be developed, and that's a big if, well, the photos might answer all these questions about the mystery, or at least some of them, and they might even tell us how John and Janet died. The film was analyzed, and it turns out that by some miracle, almost 50 years later, they were still able to develop it. It had been sitting there on the mountain for almost 50 years, but they got it. And so folks, what I have for you right here are photos taken by Janet Mae Johnson. There's shots of the mountain, those ice pillars I've talked about, the landscape, but there's also pictures of her fellow climbers, capturing just about every stage of their journey. Some were action shots, some show the climbers posing, and some even show Janet herself. She even took photos of Arnold and Bill after John had already turned around and descended. From these photos, we can take away a few new pieces of information. Some people say that the photos show that the snow on Aconcagua was very soft, meaning that the long falls and slides down the mountain that Bill and Arnold described would not have just been improbable, but were actually impossible. And in this photo, we can actually see Janet nearing the peak of Aconcagua the day before her disappearance. You can even see that she's tied to the person who took the photo by rope. And this is a bit curious because, once again, didn't Bill and Arnold say that Janet was kind of struggling and that she was behind them for most of the climb? We heard a lot about this group of climbers being disconnected, lacking camaraderie, every man and one woman for themselves. But the discovery of these photos reveal that Janet must have had at least some sort of connection with her fellow climbers. I mean, she cared enough about them to document them as part of her journey. And John, in his diary, well, he cared enough to praise Bill for all of his hard work and to show concern about the sick party members. And even though he didn't love Janet necessarily, well, he even admired some of her quirks. The last surviving member of this expedition died in 2023. And so we may never know what really happened on Aconcagua, even with these photos, unfortunately. But all of the pieces of this puzzle, the misaligned accounts, the altitude psychosis, the strange wounds in that rock, and of course the photos from Janet's camera, all of this stuff tell us that the real story of Aconcagua is definitely not the one that's widely accepted or certainly was published way back when. If you have your own take on this story or some new way to fit all these puzzle pieces together that I might have missed, please leave it in the comments. I'm honestly pretty impressed by some of the connections you guys have made to the mysteries that I bring up on this channel. And so if you feel like it, give this one a shot, try to connect those dots. Just please do so respectfully. That's all I ask. Thank you guys so much for watching. I have the best subscribers on YouTube. What a blessing it is. Seriously, I appreciate all of you so much. And YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy watching this video next. And so folks, give it a click and I will see you in the next one.